You are standing on a hilltop 15,000 years ago. Below you, a river cuts through a valley. Beyond the river, grassland stretches to the horizon. There is no fence, no wall, no sign that reads, "You are now entering anything." The ground under your feet belongs to no one. Or maybe it belongs to everyone, which, in practice, amounts to the same thing. You could walk in any direction for as long as your legs would carry you, and you would never cross a border, never show a document proving who you are, never be told you don't belong somewhere. For nearly the entire span of human existence, that was simply how things were. No countries, no nations, no lines on any map, just land and people moving across it. And then, somewhere in the last few thousand years, someone invented an idea so powerful that 8 billion people now organize almost every part of their lives around it, and most of them have never once stopped to ask where it actually came from. So how did humans invent countries? The answer doesn't start where you'd expect. It doesn't start with kings or wars or flags. It starts with something much stranger, a limit built into the human brain itself, the problem with being human. For most of our species' existence, if you asked someone, "Where are you from?" the honest answer wasn't a place, it was a family. For roughly 96% of human history, people lived in small, mobile groups, usually somewhere between 20 and 50 related individuals. No fixed address, no permanent territory in the way we understand it today. You moved when the food moved. You belonged to a group of people, not a patch of ground. And that group held together because of something very specific. You knew everyone in it personally. In 1992, an evolutionary psychologist at Oxford named Robin Dunbar proposed something that reshaped how anthropologists think about human societies. He argued that the human brain has a hard cognitive limit on the number of stable social relationships it can actually maintain. That number sits somewhere around 150. It's now known, somewhat inevitably, as Dunbar's number. Below 150 people, you can track who's who. You know who's related to whom, who owes who a favor, who's been feuding with who for the last 3 winters. You can govern an entire group through nothing more than gossip, reputation, and the quiet pressure of people who simply know your name and your history. Above that number, the system collapses. You cannot personally hold 300 relationships in your head. You cannot remember every debt, every grudge, every alliance. And when that system breaks down, you need something new to hold people together, something bigger than a family tree. Now think about what that means for the existence of a country. Every country on Earth today holds vastly more than 150 people. India holds over 1 billion. Iceland, one of the smallest, still holds hundreds of thousands. Even Vatican City, the tiniest recognized state on the planet, has several hundred residents. None of these can run purely on personal relationships. Every one of them needed a structure that the human brain was never built to provide on its own. The country, in other words, is a workaround for a bug in human cognition. But that workaround didn't appear overnight. It took thousands of years to build, and it started with a decision that doesn't sound political at all. The decision to stop moving. Around 12,500 BC, in the region we now call the Levant, a culture known as the Natufians did something unusual. They stopped moving. Archaeologist Dorothy Garrod first identified this culture in 1928 while excavating a site called Shukba Cave. Decades later, further excavations led by Jean Perrot at a site called Ain Malaha uncovered circular stone houses, grinding tools, storage pits, and formal cemeteries. These weren't temporary hunting camps. These were villages, occupied year-round, by people who had decided that this particular stretch of ground was home. And here's the detail that matters most for our story. They were still hunter-gatherers. They hadn't invented farming yet. They settled down first and figured out agriculture later. Why does that matter so much? Because settling down fundamentally changes your relationship with the ground beneath your feet. When you're nomadic, land is something you pass through, a resource you use and leave behind. But when you're settled, land becomes something you invest in. You clear it, you store food in it, and eventually, you bury your dead in it. And once you've buried your ancestors somewhere, that ground stops being just dirt. It becomes identity. In 1973, archaeologist Colin Renfrew published research arguing that the massive stone tombs and monuments scattered across Neolithic Western Europe functioned as territorial markers. You put your dead into the ground to send a message to everyone else. This land belongs to the people who came from these bones. The first border markers in human history weren't fences, they were graves. That is the first seed of a country, not a law, not an army, a burial. the temple before the city. But houses and graves alone weren't enough to bind large numbers of people together. For that, you needed something that could connect total strangers, people who had never shared a meal or buried a relative in the same soil. You needed a shared belief. In southeastern Turkey, at a site called Gobekli Tepe, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began digging in 1995. What he found didn't fit the established timeline of human civilization at all. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, carved with animal reliefs and arranged in circular enclosures. The site dates to roughly 9,500 BC. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids. And here's the part that changes everything. The people who built Gobekli Tepe weren't farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. They had no permanent settlement nearby. They traveled from scattered bands across the region, gathered at this one site, and built something monumental together, with no state, no king, no bureaucracy to organize them. Before his death in 2014, Schmidt summarized his conclusion in a single phrase that rewrote archaeology textbooks. First came the temple, then the city. The desire to gather for shared ritual, to worship together, to participate in something bigger than your own band of 50 people, may be what drove humans to settle down in the first place. Religion came before agriculture. Belief came before borders. Think about what that means. Dunbar's number tells us you can't personally know more than 150 people, but you can believe in the same God as 10,000 people you've never met in your life. Shared belief was the first technology that let humans cooperate beyond the limits of personal relationship. And every country that has ever existed runs on some version of that exact same technology, a shared story that binds strangers together. At Gobekli Tepe, that story was carved into stone. Today, it's printed on a passport. But belief alone still doesn't make a state. For that, you need something far more mundane. You need grain. Why grain built the state? Around 10,000 BC, in the region known as the Fertile Crescent, humans began domesticating wheat and barley. In 1997, geneticist Manfred Huhn and his team used DNA fingerprinting to trace the domestication of einkorn wheat to the slopes of a mountain called Karakada, just 30 kilometers from Gobekli Tepe. Agriculture changed everything, but not for the reason most people assume. In 2017, political scientist James C. Scott published a book called Against the Grain that makes an argument almost nobody expects. Scott argues that the first states didn't form around just any crop. They formed specifically around grain. Not rice, not yams, not cassava. Grain. The reason is almost embarrassingly simple. Grain is visible. It ripens at a predictable time. It stands above ground where anyone can see it. It can be measured, divided, stored, and transported. In other words, grain can be taxed. A yam growing underground is invisible. You can leave it in the soil and dig it up whenever you want. Nobody walking past your field can count your yams. But wheat stands in a field, ripening all at once, visible to anyone with eyes. Scott's argument is that the earliest states, the ancestors of what would become countries, were essentially grain taxation operations. And everything else, the borders, the armies, the bureaucracies, the laws, existed to make that taxation possible. Every passport you've ever held, every national anthem you've ever heard, every war ever fought over a line on a map. Trace it back far enough, and part of that chain runs through the simple, unglamorous fact that wheat is easy to count. But before you can tax grain, you need walls. The oldest walls on Earth. Around 8,000 BC, a settlement called Jericho built a stone wall roughly 3.6 meters high and nearly 2 meters thick. Attached to it stood a circular stone tower over 8 meters tall with an internal staircase of 22 stone steps. Archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated the site in the 1950s and concluded it was the world's oldest known military fortification. Other researchers, including Harvard's Ofer Bar Yosef, have argued it may have been a flood barrier instead. James Scott, characteristically, suggested something else entirely, that the walls of early cities were as much about keeping the labor force in as keeping enemies out. Early states needed to retain their populations because populations meant labor, and labor meant taxable output. Whether the wall at Jericho was a fortress, a dam, or something closer to a labor enclosure, building it required an estimated 11,000 person days of organized work. Somebody planned it. Somebody directed it. Somebody fed the workers while they built it. That is not a family project. That is administration. And administration is the skeleton a country eventually grows around. Grain, power, and the birth of inequality. Once you have surplus grain and walls to protect it, the next thing that appears is inequality. At a site called Dra in the Jordan Valley, archaeologists Ian Quate and Bill Finlayson uncovered one of the oldest known granaries in the world in 2009. dating back roughly 11,300 years. It had raised floors specifically designed to prevent moisture and rodent damage. Someone understood food preservation over 11,000 years ago. And whoever controlled that granary controlled the food supply. And whoever controlled the food supply had power. In their 2012 book, The Creation of Inequality, anthropologists Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus traced this exact pattern across multiple ancient civilizations. Early egalitarian bands operated on what they called a logic of equality, leveling mechanisms like ridicule, gossip, and social exclusion that prevented any one person from accumulating too much power. Think about what that means. For tens of thousands of years, if you tried to appoint yourself chief, your own community would simply mock you until you stopped. The shift toward inequality happened when ambitious individuals figured out how to override those leveling mechanisms, usually by claiming a special relationship with the gods or by controlling stored surplus directly. Once temporary prestige hardened into hereditary rank, you were one step away from a king. And once you had a king, you were one step away from a kingdom. A kingdom is, in the simplest possible terms, a country with a crown, the first city. But a kingdom of 200 people in a mud brick village still isn't a country. For that, you need a city. And the first true city on Earth is where the idea of a country really begins to take its modern shape. Around 3,500 BC, in southern Mesopotamia, a settlement called Uruk began growing into something the world had genuinely never seen before. By roughly 3,100 BC, it covered over 250 hectares and may have housed tens of thousands of people. Archaeologist Robert McCormick Adams surveyed the site extensively and published his findings in 1981. Uruk was, by any reasonable definition, the first true city in human history. And a city of 40,000 people has a problem a village of 150 simply doesn't. You cannot run it on personal relationships. You cannot govern it by gossip. You need record keeping. You need standardized measurement. You need to know precisely who owes what to whom. So they invented writing, the country built on paperwork. Here's where the story gets genuinely surprising, because writing wasn't invented for poetry. It wasn't invented for prayer or philosophy or storytelling. It was invented for accounting. The earliest known written documents are proto-cuneiform tablets recovered from Uruk, dating to roughly 3,400 to 3,200 BC. Over 5,000 of them have been found. More than 85% of them are administrative records, grain distributions, worker ration lists, livestock inventories. In her 1992 book, Before Writing, archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat traced the entire evolutionary path of writing back to small clay tokens used for counting goods, some dating as far back as 8,000 BC. Those tokens evolved into impressions pressed into clay envelopes. Those impressions eventually became written symbols pressed onto flat tablets. The first written word in human history was probably not God, probably not love, probably not war. It was probably a number, sitting next to a crude drawing of a sack of barley. The country, in a very real sense, was built on paperwork. Alongside writing, Uruk also mass-produced something archaeologists call beveled rim bowls, crude, undecorated clay bowls, all made to roughly the same size, found in enormous quantities across the region. Researchers Hans Nissen and Gregory Johnson argue that these were standardized ration containers used by early administrators to distribute measured daily portions of grain to workers. Same size bowl, same amount of food, every single day. That's not hospitality, that's a payroll system. And a payroll system is, functionally, a government. The first drawn border. With writing and administration in place, real formal borders followed. Around 2500 BC, two Sumerian city-states named Lagash and Umma went to war over a strip of fertile farmland called the Gu Edina. Around 2550 BC, a king named Mesalim of Kish arbitrated the dispute by physically surveying the land and erecting an inscribed stone marker along the boundary line. When Umma later violated that agreement, the ruler of Lagash, King Eannatum, defeated them in battle and erected a monument known today as the Stele of the Vultures, around 2450 BC. It depicts soldiers marching in tight formation and vultures carrying off the remains of the defeated. The inscription records the re-establishment of the border, along with divine curses aimed at anyone who dared cross it again. That stele, discovered in 1881 and now housed in the Louvre, is one of the oldest known records of a formally documented political border anywhere on Earth. Two states, arguing over exactly where one ends and the other begins. Sound familiar? Why some places became countries first, but a boundary marker between two city-states still isn't quite a country. A country requires something more, the idea that everyone living inside that line belongs together, even if they've never met one another. In 1970, anthropologist Robert Carnero proposed an explanation for why states first emerged where they did. He called it environmental circumscription. The idea is straightforward. In places where fertile land is boxed in by natural barriers, deserts, mountains, oceans, growing populations end up competing for a fixed, limited amount of farmland. When conflict breaks out in that kind of environment, the losers can't simply pack up and move somewhere else. There's nowhere to go, so they get absorbed into the winner's territory instead. Village absorbs village, chiefdom absorbs chiefdom. Eventually, you get a state. Carnero pointed to the Nile Valley, boxed in by desert on both sides, coastal Peru, squeezed between the Andes and the Pacific, the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In every case, geography trapped people together and forced them to figure out how to live at a scale their brains were never designed for. And the archaeological evidence for that trapping, for the violence that comes before a border becomes official, is older than most people realize. At a site called Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, excavations beginning in the 1960s uncovered 59 skeletons dating back roughly 13,000 years. At least 24 of them showed clear signs of violent death, with stone projectile points still embedded in the bone. A reanalysis published in 2021 confirmed these weren't casualties of a single skirmish. They represented repeated, long-term violence between groups competing over access to the Nile during a period of severe drought. At a site called Nataruk, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, a team led by researcher Marta Mirazan-Lar published findings in 2016 describing 27 individuals, roughly 10,000 years old, with skulls crushed by blunt force, ribs broken, and obsidian arrow points still lodged in bone. Men, women, at least one pregnant woman. This wasn't a duel. This was a massacre, and it happened along a lakeshore rich in resources. People were fighting and dying over territory thousands of years before anyone thought to draw a formal line on the ground and call it a border. The violence came first. The border came later, as a way of trying to make the violence stop. One ruler, two lands. In Egypt, a carved slab of stone known as the Narmer palette, discovered in 1898, shows a king named Narmer wearing the combined crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt. It dates to roughly 3100 BC. One ruler, two lands, unified into a single political entity. That is the outline of a country. And it was established the way many countries since have been established, by force. But not every early civilization followed that same script. A country without a king. In the Indus Valley, between roughly 2600 and 1900 BC, a civilization emerged at sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro that covered a larger area than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Their cities were built on precise grid layouts. Their bricks were standardized across settlements separated by over 1,000 kilometers, all following the exact same proportional ratio. They had standardized weights, sophisticated drainage systems, in some cases more advanced than anything Europe would build for thousands of years afterward, and a writing system that, to this day, nobody has managed to decipher. And yet, as archaeologist Gregory Possehl argued in a 2002 study, there's almost no evidence of palaces, no monumental royal tombs, no autocratic kings depicted anywhere, no giant statues glorifying a ruler, no imagery of conquering armies. Researcher Jonathan Mark Knoyer has proposed that the Indus Valley civilization may have functioned as a kind of confederation, governed not by a single monarch, but by merchant guilds and ritual elites who maintained order through shared economic standards rather than military force. If that's accurate, and the debate among archaeologists is far from settled, then the Indus Valley is proof that a country doesn't have to look like Egypt. It doesn't have to begin with a conqueror. It can begin with a shared system of weights and measures, and a mutual agreement that everyone uses bricks of the exact same size, which, when you actually sit with that idea, is a kind of social contract written in clay. What was still missing? But even Egypt, even Mesopotamia, even the Indus Valley, even China, where the Shang dynasty was governing through oracle bone inscriptions and bronze ritual vessels by 1600 BC, these were kingdoms, empires, confederations, not countries exactly, not in the way we understand the word today. A modern country requires one more ingredient that ancient empires never fully had. It requires that ordinary people, Not just kings, not just priests, feel that they belong to the same community as millions of total strangers. And that particular invention is shockingly recent. In 1962, anthropologist Elman Service outlined a framework that anthropology students still learn today. Bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, each one representing a larger, more complex form of political organization than the last. But a legal historian named Henry Maine, writing all the way back in 1861, identified something maybe even more important. In his work Ancient Law, Maine described a transformation in how human societies organize themselves, a shift from organization based on status, meaning who you're related to, toward organization based on contract, meaning where you live and what you owe. For most of human history, you belong to a clan. A country asks you to belong to a territory instead. That is not a small change. That is a complete rewiring of how a person understands who they are. The idea that made you a citizen. The final piece of the puzzle isn't archaeological, it's philosophical. In 1576, political theorist Jean Bodin defined the concept of sovereignty, the idea that a state holds absolute, uncontested authority over its territory. In 1625, Hugo Grotius laid the groundwork for what would eventually become international law, treating states as coherent legal persons capable of holding rights and obligations, much like individuals. And in 1648, a set of agreements known as the Peace of Westphalia ended a brutal, decades-long war across Europe and, in doing so, established a principle that still underpins the entire modern world, that each state holds sovereign authority within its own borders and that other states are obligated to respect that boundary. This is, in many ways, the true birth of the country as we understand it today. Not a kingdom claimed by conquest, not a city held together by shared ritual. A defined territory with defined borders, recognized by other territories as a legitimate, self-governing entity. But even Westphalia didn't create citizens. It created states that respected each other's borders. The idea that the ordinary people inside those borders were meaningfully connected to one another, that a farmer in one corner of a country and a merchant in another corner were part of the same imagined community, that came even later. Historian Benedict Anderson, in his influential 1983 work, gave this concept a name that has stuck ever since: the imagined community. Anderson argued that a nation is, fundamentally, a group of people who will never meet almost any of the other members, and yet who carry in their minds a shared image of belonging to something together. He pointed to the printing press as one of the most underrated inventions in this entire story. Once books and newspapers could be mass-produced in a shared language, strangers hundreds of kilometers apart could read the exact same words on the exact same day and begin to imagine themselves as part of one continuous us. That's not a small technical detail. That is, arguably, the final piece of technology required to build a country. Writing gave you administration, grain gave you taxation, walls gave you containment, war gave you borders. But the printing press and everything that came after it, newspapers, mass literacy, national education systems, gave you something no ancient empire ever fully achieved: millions of strangers who felt, genuinely, like they belonged to one another. Back to the hilltop. So think back to that hilltop, 15,000 years ago. No fence, no wall, no document proving you belong there. It took a settled village to turn land into identity. It took a shared belief to bind strangers together beyond the limits of personal memory. It took visible, countable grain to justify taxation. It took walls to defend what had been claimed. It took inequality and kings and cities too large to govern through gossip. It took writing, invented not for poetry but for counting sacks of barley. It took formally drawn borders, fought over and inscribed in stone. It took geography that trapped people together with nowhere left to run. And finally, it took a printing press, spreading a shared story to millions of people who would never meet each other in person. None of that was inevitable. None of it was designed in advance by anyone with a plan. It accumulated slowly, in fragments, over roughly 15,000 years, built by people solving immediate problems who had no idea they were inventing one of the most powerful ideas our species has ever created. Today, that idea is so completely embedded in how you think about the world that it feels natural, obvious, like it's always been there. It hasn't. For nearly the entire span of human existence, that hilltop belonged to no one. Or maybe, in the way that mattered most, it belonged to everyone.